Hello. Welcome to Community Homeworks Workshop this evening. We are so glad that you're joining us. My name is Tiana Harrison, and I'm the Education and Volunteer Coordinator at Community Homeworks. This Green Living Workshop was made possible by the generous support of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation's Love Where You Live Environment Fund. If you're watching this live, please feel free to comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you would like to join in on the discussion or ask questions, please put that in the comment section as well. If you're watching this after the live broadcast, we are still happy to answer questions. It just may take us a little longer to respond. Community Homeworks is a nonprofit organization with the mission to empower homeowners to maintain safe, sustainable, and dignified homes. We get our fundings from grants, gifts, and donations. So if you find value in this workshop tonight, please donate on our website at communityhomeworks.org. Tonight's workshop is titled Fall and Winter Gardening, and our instructor is Miss Mandy Dixon. Thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to learning more about fall and winter gardening.
Hello.
Hello.
How is everybody tonight? We're running a little bit late with some technical difficulties, but we're going to jump right in and we'll catch everybody up. My name again is Mandy Dixon. I'm an MSU Extension Master Gardener, and today we're going to just talk about some fall cleanup and winter things you can do in the winter. So we'll start with our presentation today and get going. So this is about putting your garden to bed and winter sowing. Let's go to the next slide. So today, specifically, we're going to talk about fall garden cleanup, some winter sowing, and give you some resources so you can research this more in your own time. Next slide, please. Go ahead. Fall cleanup. Next. What is fall cleanup? Fall cleanup is getting your beds prepared before winter, before the snow flies, or if you're running a little late, just after the snow flies, so that your garden is ready to go in the spring. And why do we do it? We do it so that you will have a healthier garden, fewer pests, fewer diseases. You'll have an easier time to get started in the spring. It's just overall, it's going to make your garden healthier. So let's go to the next slide. So the priority chores. First, you're going to make sure you clean all of your garden tools. You're not just going to wash them, but you want to start there. So rinse off dirt, dry them thoroughly, scrub brush if you've got sap. Um, you can use some soap if you need to. Dish soap works great. Wipe down all the wood handles with a linseed oil or a mineral oil if you don't have that. It conditions them and keeps them lasting longer for you. You dry all the tools well and hang them inside. Don't put them against the garage wall touching the floor because there is probably moisture from the floor, and moisture is going to make your tools rust and your handles get um, damaged. So the point of this is making sure everything is clean and ready to go before you put them away for the fall. So that way your tools will last longer. Let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the things you should be doing the entire time, if you want to go back a slide, is disposing of diseased and insect damaged plant material. So if you find a disease in your garden, you get a powdery mildew on some of your zucchini plants, for example, you're going to want to pull that plant material out of the garden right away and dispose of it. You're not going to put that in your compost pile. You're not going to leave that there and let that sit over the winter. You're going to get rid of that right away. Or if you get insect damage, let's say you get those squash vine borers, or you get potato beetles, or you get something else, make sure you get those insect pests out of the garden right away and dispose of them. Don't put them in your mulch pile, um, your compost pile. So the reason you're doing that is to prevent issues further down the road. The more pests that are in the garden that you leave in the garden, the more will come back the following year. So you're going to mulch your empty beds or plant a cover crop. So mulching your beds will help prevent winter weeds. There are actually weeds that grow in the winter. If you've ever cleaned out a bed and then let it sit, you'll see that in a few weeks you'll start seeing stuff even in November. As soon as the ground does not have any snow on it, you get weeds and they just grow. So you can either mulch them to protect the soil from getting starting to grow those weeds, or you can put a cover crop. So you can plant like oats or an annual rye. You'd plant those about this time of year, and they'll establish, and then they will die off over the winter, and you'll just um, fold them into your ground in the spring. Once you can work it, you'll just work them right into the ground, and they'll decompose and they'll fertilize your crops a little bit more. Cover crops also increase the number of microorganisms in the soil, and they're usually nitrogen fixing, which basically means they can take nitrogen and take it from the oil, or I'm sorry, the waters, the soils, the stuff. They actually attach that to themselves. They create nitrogen and put it into the soil through their roots. So that is going to increase your nitrogen in your soil, and you won't have to add as much fertilizer. Um, there It most plants use nitrogen, so having something that actually puts nitrogen back in the soil is a benefit to you. So planting a cover crop is also referred as green manure, which basically means that again, it's acting as almost a compost for you. So you're going to take the cover crop, plant it, and it'll die off once it gets a heavy, heavy freeze, and you'll just turn that into your soil, and that'll break down and create an additional layer of compost right in your garden bed. Let's go to the next slide. So, why do you mulch? Well, we talked about the weeds, but it also improves soil because mulch does break down. It also keeps the top of the soil moist and cool or warm in the winter. It actually keeps the temperature a little more level. It provides nutrients as it breaks down. It will actually add nutrients to your soil. So it's again acting like a compost. As it breaks down, it will release nutrients. It prevents weeds, including the winter growing ones. Some of the ones that we were talking about that can actually grow in the winter is like a hairy bittercress, a yellow rocket, um, a whitlow grass. But if you look at that link right there, we could probably put that link into the chat for you. And that talks about spring and blooming lawn and garden weeds. These are ones that actually establish themselves in the winter. We can do that at the end if we can't copy it now, but it looks like maybe we've got it. Maybe not, but we can do it at the end because I should be able to grab that from here. So I'll do that at the end. Let's go to the next slide. Why else do we want to mulch? It conserves water. It also reduces disease. Now, how does it reduce disease? The layer of mulch prevents the water from hitting the soil and splashing the soil up on leaves. A lot of your diseases will rest in the soil from year after year, and just they create a larger mess in the soil. By covering that soil with a layer of mulch, of clean mulch, non-disease free mulch anyway, it will prevent the splashback, which then prevents it from getting on the leaves, and that also helps reduce those disease pressures on your plants. Eliminates cultivating. You don't have to sit there with a rototiller. If you keep a nice layer of mulch on your ground, it keeps it soft. It helps it prevent compacting. You can mix it in the spring and add another layer, but you don't actually have to use like a rototiller. And it can improve your production because of all these other things, because it's reducing disease, conserving water. So your production will actually increase. You'll have more vegetables out of your garden. Let's go to the next slide. So now the question becomes, what do you do in the fall? You're going to clean your tools, you're going to mulch your beds, you're going to get rid of all your diseased and dying and pest-ridden plant material. But what about the rest of the stuff? You have a couple choices. One, you can leave it. If you leave it, it's a potential happy place for pollinators, especially those stalks that are hollow and have they have a hollow tube inside of them. So you have some of your perennials, some of your like corn stalks, things like that. If you can leave parts of those plants out, it does provide places for those pollinators and other, like your bees, some of your ground bees. Not the ground bees as much, but some of those pollinators will actually live. They crawl into those stems and stalks, and they can overwinter there. However, in some communities, you can't leave that in the ground. So you will have to pull those out if you're in one of those communities that won't let you leave that sort of material out. There's pests and diseases. If you've had those pressures in your garden, you'll want to get rid of all of those just to prevent that problem. But there's some benefits for leaving those type of things out for your environment, because those bees and other bugs that live in those tubes can be pollinators, and they can be a benefit to your garden the following year. So I do end up leaving some of my plant material out, and then I pull some of it. Just depends on where it's at. But you also have seen, I'm sure most of you have seen those bee hotels, those bug hotels. It's the same concept as that. The thing is, if you leave it out, you need to leave it out in the spring until things start growing again so that those pollinators have time to emerge from their nests over the winter. This is a article from Oregon State, actually, their extension program on should you wait to help conserve for the insects, basically. So we can paste that one again at the end, and I can move that if necessary, so everybody can have access to it. I'll put it in this, if we can put it in the chat. I'm not sure if I can add to chat, but I can get those. Let's go to the next slide. So what else do you need to do? If you have any perennials like cannas, dahlias, and glads, they cannot overwinter. So those type of perennials will need to be pulled up. You can dig them up. You can brush off the dirt, rinse them off, then dry them well. You're not going to dry them out. We're not trying to dehydrate them, but we need to dry off all the water so they won't um, soak. They won't have, they'll eventually mold if they're too moist. But you can store them over the winter and you can grow them the next year. Uh, you need to keep them in a place that's dry but cool. So, a basement or potentially a garage if it's protected and insulated. You can put them in layers of straw, but you'll have to check them. You can put them in layers of newspaper and you can store them over the winter and bring them back out next spring. You also want to plant garlic this time of year before the ground freezes. So sometime in end of September, early October, or even mid-October, you can plant that garlic. It'll get established and it will actually be ready for you to go in summer. Just make sure you know exactly where you put it and don't start pulling it up in the spring thinking it's a weed. So let's go to the next slide. So what else do you want to do? You're going to want to update your garden notebook. Now, if you haven't been keeping one, you'll want to start doing that now. Because what your garden notebook is it tells you what you had in what beds. So I assume you're going to have let's say you have one big garden vegetable bed. You want to know where in that vegetable bed you put your tomatoes and where you put your spinach and where you put your broccoli. Because you're going to want to make sure you rotate in your bed, or if you have multiple beds, rotate which bed you're in, so that your plants require different nutrients, and plants that are similar don't share diseases and pests, and again the nutrient load. So like if you have peas, for example, peas are nitrogen fixing, so peas will put nitrogen into the ground. So next year in that place where you've put nitrogen in the ground, you can put like your tomatoes because they need a lot of nitrogen in order to grow large. And it also, if there was diseases or pests on those peas, you obviously got rid of all that plant material already. But next year, not only will you have nitrogen, but you potentially have pests from those pea plants, but they won't impact the tomatoes because they're different. Pests don't typically spread for more than a few different types of vegetables. So you should have better luck next year with fewer pests in that space if you move your peas to a different spot. You're also going to look at what kind of challenges you had. So, did this one specific type of tomato you grew not do very well? Was it a wet summer and therefore things may be different next year if it's a dry summer? It just gives you a place to write all the details down because you're not going to remember from year to year. And you want to at least rotate things every couple of years. So you're not going to put the same, your tomatoes will not go in the same place for at least 2 to 3 years if you can help it. At least move them usually it's at least 3 years between planting of the same thing in the same spot if you can manage that. Crop rotation is important for a lot of reasons. It helps with your production. You'll get more production if you don't have the same plant taking the same type of nutrients out of the soil. And it helps you see, hey, I really liked this type of a beet. This beet was just amazing. It grew great. Let's grow it again next year and see what happens. It also gives you a good time at this time of the year to do a soil test. You can take your soil test, turn that into the extension. They'll get that processed for you, and you can start adding your nutrients now for next spring. So then in the spring, all you have to do is start planting. If you're not able to do a soil test, you can still put in a basic general fertilizer and get the soil prepped for next year. Let's go to the next slide. So now that you have your garden notebook, and your garden notebook has everything that happened this past year and what you grew where and all the details of any pests or diseases you ran into and had to deal with, now you're going to figure out what do you want to grow next year. So you discovered that you had 6 zucchini plants, for example, and you and your family and your neighbors and your coworkers and your friends that you didn't know existed all hate you because you've given them too many zucchinis. This is a way to realize, wait, I had way too many zucchini this year. I need to cut back and only have 2 or 3 plants instead of 6. Or I didn't have anywhere near enough green beans, and I really like green beans. So now you know you had 6 plants last year. Let's make it 8 plants or 12 plants. It just depends on how much production you got and how much your family is actually going to use. If you grew something and your family hated it and you hated it, nobody ate it, and it just went to waste, then that's something you probably don't want to plant again next year. It gives you an idea of what do you want to grow, how much you want to grow, and where are you going to put the plants so that they'll have better success next year. So let's go to the next slide. So, lawns. I'm only going to talk really briefly about this, and this is just what you can do to kind of prepare for winter. You can mulch your leaves into your lawn. Set your mower height as high as it'll go and mow at your normal speed, and that'll mulch those leaves and that'll help build the soil in your lawn. Don't let them pile up more than 3 to 4 inches deep before you mow them, though, because otherwise you can kill your grass. And once the lawn stops mowing, lower the height for your final mow. It'll help clean up the lawn, prevent grass from being too tall going into the winter, and it reduces problems with voles and snow mold. So again, the biggest thing is just mulch those leaves in. Don't necessarily have to remove them. You don't have to rake them away. Just mow them down because that'll fertilize your lawn over the winter. Let's go to the next. Now that you've done everything this fall and there's nothing on your plate anymore, and you sit back and you enjoy all of November and December, and you're like, okay, now what can I do? What can I do this winter? Because I'm itching to get started in the spring. I'm having set cabin fever. I really want to get started in my garden. What can I do? Well, one of the things you can do is winter sowing. Now you've done your garden notebook. You know exactly what you want to plant this year. You've gone looking at your seed catalogs, or you've just gone looking, digging through your seeds, and you know what you want to grow. So, winter sowing is a way you can start seeds in the winter, in the middle of the winter. So, let's go to the next slide. So, this is a way to get head start on some plants. It's an outdoor method of seed germination. It was actually invented by Trudy Davidoff, which requires just 2 things: miniature greenhouses, which we use recycled milk jugs and water jugs, and a little bit of time. So let's go to the next slide. So why? We talked about why, because we can get a head start on spring. but it also helps you do things in the middle of winter when you're experiencing cabin fever, and it lets you get a little bit of a head start on spring when things go a little crazy. Because I don't know about you, but come April, I'm starting to get a little antsy. I'm trying to get things done. I'm cleaning up the garden the rest of the way. I'm getting those beds out. I'm getting some plants started. Um, so doing things in December, January, February when things have calmed down helps me get a little bit ahead of the game. So what winter sowing is it's kind of acts like mother nature, but you're giving it just a little bit of help. As the You're going to have the seeds outside and you're going to have them in these jugs, and we'll look through that here in a minute. But as the dirt that you're putting in these plant houses, these little greenhouses, freezes and thaws over the winter, your seeds freeze and thaw, which loosens the seed coatings. And then in the spring, you've got them in a container that's actually somewhat covered, so that protects them a little bit, and they'll get a little warmer than the ground. They'll grow a little faster. It's kind of like having a cold frame out there. So let's go to the next slide. Now, what can be winter sown? Most hardy annuals and perennials can be winter sown. You can look for any of these terms on your seed packet. They need, like, it needs pre-chilling, or like freeze your seeds, or refrigerate your seeds, stratify your seeds for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. If it says it will colonize, or if it self sows, so anything that you know that spreads itself can be done, because those are things that the seeds will drop on the ground and it'll regrow, and that's one of the things this method is great for. If it says sow in the winter, late summer, early winter, you can potentially do this. So outdoors in the early spring while the nights are still cool. Anything that says those type of things. Now you're not going to do things like tomatoes typically, because the tomatoes, if they get a hard freeze, they're going to just die. And this type of environment will not help with that. So those are tender annuals. We're just looking for some of the hardier ones. So sorry, let's go to the next slide. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your milk jug or your water jug, and you're going to cut it in half, but leave the last little bit near the handle intact. So you can see how that jug is wide open now. And then you're going to poke holes around the bottom. Just be careful. Don't stab yourself. It's very easy to do if you're not being careful. So you're now got a jug that's can be split open, and there's drainage holes in the bottom. So let's go to the next slide. You're going to fill the bottom half of that container with soil. Best choice is like a seed starting or a light, fluffy potting mixture. You can do a peat moss perlite mix of any sort. You can buy those in the store. Pretty much any kind of light potting soil or seed starting mix works great. If you want to put about 2 to 3 inches worth, so make sure the bottom of your jug is at least 3 inches worth. And then you're going to moisten the soil. We're going to prep this as though we're getting ready to plant actual seeds out in the ground or in a pot. So you're getting your soil out, you're moistening it. You've got your mixture in the bottom of your jug. Put your seeds in. You'll want to put the seed in and then add soil to the top to equal your planting depth. So if those seeds are supposed to go in a 1/2 inch, you'll want at least a 1/2 inch on top of those seeds. If you have to press them in the dirt a little further to get it in, that's fine. Just want at least a couple inches below it and the correct amount on top. So you've got your seed in there and ready to go. Let's go to the next slide. You're going to label your container because you're going to want to know what you put in there. So if you put broccoli seeds in there, for example, you're going to want to write broccoli on it. Use a permanent marker or a paint pen. You can take the lid off of it. Um, so you don't want a lid on the top of your container. And then you're going to tape it closed. I like to use the clear packing tape just to tape it closed. You don't tape it, seal it all the way around. You just put a couple of pieces of tape, because then air and everything can still go on the sides a little bit. But you're going to put at least a couple pieces of tape and just keep that down. So now you've got yourself a little greenhouse. And you can see they put them in little containers, so that way it's easier to move them around. And the biggest thing is put them in a place that won't get blown away if we have a blizzard. So I like to put them under the patio table. and make sure they're nice and secure. Sometimes I'll even tie the handles to the patio container if I don't have them in a container, and if I don't have them in a plastic tote like that, I'll just literally tie them to the base of the table so they can't blow away. And the goal is to get these out there sometime after the first snow. You don't really want to put them out there until after it snows. So I usually do it sometime December, January. That way it has enough time over the winter to freeze and thaw multiple times before it starts warming up. So let's go to the next slide. Now, what's going to happen next? So you've let it go, and now you're starting to see April. It's starting to thaw. You get some in March, and then it gets more in April. By the time April hits, it's going to they're going to start sprouting. So the first hint of spring, but while nights are still freezing, the seedlings will start to emerge. You'll want to start checking for water. So you can pop open off that tape, check them, water them a little bit. You've already watered them before you put them out there, but you're going to want to start watering them now as it dries. Um, be careful. These are little bitty baby plants, so just gently do it. And then close the tops. Now you do have a hole in the top, so if it rains, it will get a little bit then. On warm, sunny days when it starts warming up, and you're hitting those really warm, hot days almost, pop the lid open so that it doesn't cook. But make sure you close it again at night so that as it freezes, it won't kill the plants off. So you're basically just playing like this is a cold frame. Cold frames you have to open up if it gets too hot so that they have some airflow, and then you close them at night so they don't get too cold. So you're just babying them a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. So now what are you going to do? You've got these just little seedlings in your gallon jug, and everything is planted outside based on the frost-free date. So Kalamazoo is in Garden Zone 6A. So if you look at those packages, the seed packs, it'll tell you, where what zone these vegetables or flowers can be grown in. 6A is or lower is what you can do. So you can be in 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, but you shouldn't be trying for things that are 7 until after it warms up significantly, which was the frost-free date. But these plants you have, they're already in a little mini greenhouse, so you just want to look for that frost-free date, which is around May 15th. And then you can put them outside as long as there's no heavy frost predicted for the next little bit. But if you have to, you can always cover them up. I tend to leave mine in until the end of May just to be safe. End of, 30th, 28th, somewhere in that range so that it's had a little bit more time. And then you can start planting them in the garden. And if you look at those plants in your little containers, they're actually going to be a little hardier than the plants that are started in a greenhouse because they're already gotten used to the environment out there, and you don't really have to harden them off like you do something that comes from the greenhouse. So let's go to the next slide. And in the spring, this is what you can look forward to is whole big plants that are ready to go. You can do your spinaches this way. If you want to have a nice healthy spinach salad first thing in the spring, you can just open up the plant the container that you've put spinach in, and go ahead and cut yourself some spinach out of there. But it's kind of a nice way to get a head start and do something in the middle of winter. Those really cold January days where you're like, I just want to be in my garden. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just some of your resources. Let's go to the slide and it'll show you the links. So I always like to say, we all know that if it's on the internet, it must be true. Or you can say, fake news, fake news. You've just got to be careful when you're looking at things on the internet that you're actually using scientific based resources because we all know that the internet is full of anything and everything you can find. So let's make sure whatever sources you're using are of an education based, scientifically studied background instead of just whatever you can find. Because you can always find old wives' tales that say you can, salt your garden and it'll improve the soil health, but there's definitely pros and cons to doing things like that, mostly cons. So just make sure you're using science-based resources. So the first one I give you is Gardening in Michigan. That's an MSU extension website. So it's migarden.msu.edu. There's a website here that is actually from the Michigan Extension Consumer Resource or Consumer Horticulture Group, and it's October Lawn and Garden Tasks. It's an older one, but it does go through a lot of the things we just talked about. And then there's also one on winter sowing at wintersown.org, and it talks to you all through the process of how to winter sow in much more detail than I actually went through. So these are some of the resources that'll help you in your in this whole fall cleanup and winter sowing and just in general in gardening. Let's go to the next slide. I think we're done, but yep, gardening is learning, learning, learning. That's the fun of them. You're always learning because you can learn something new every single year in the garden. So thank you. I think the next slide is just our closing and that we are an MSU is an affirmative action equal opportunity employer. Um, but that's it. Do you have any questions?
So I do have a question, Mandy. Could you give us like a general timeline in of the most effective way to do this cleanup?
Yeah, absolutely. Generally speaking, you're going to kind of hold a lot of these things till after the first frost. So typically in Michigan, those first freeze or in count this area, it's typically around the middle of October. So you can start cleaning up any tools you're not going to use. Like I'm pretty much done with my pruners this time of year. So I will start doing that at the end of September. I'll start cleaning up some of my tools that I'm not going to use over the winter or that I'm not using from this point forward. I'll start cleaning out my beds once things start dying. And then come mid October, when everything's frozen because we've had a couple of hard frosts, that's when I'll do the clean out of whatever needs to be cleaned out, my zucchini plants or cucumber plants, whatever's kind of trailing on the ground and it's now dead. As long as it wasn't diseased in advance, those you do all the time. So then come mid October, you're cleaning out all of your garden beds, your plants, anything you're not leaving over the winter. You'll clean out your tools sometime about the same time. Some of the stuff I start a little early just because I know I'm not going to use them between now and then. And then you're going to put in, now that you cleaned out your beds as much as you're going to, you'll start doing your nutrients, your soil tests if you're going to do that this year. I tend to do that once every 3 to 5 years. So it just depends on what your cycle is. And then, you know, it's pretty much that's it. You're going to clean up your beds, clean up everything. I do my garden notes throughout the year, but I do a final notation about the same time of the freeze. And I also note when that freeze happens. So I have a better feel for it for the following year. And then that's when I start looking at my garden setup for the following years. Usually that's my January task is starting any winter sowing and any garden planning. I start in January because I want to make it through the holidays first. So once I'm through the holidays, that's when I'm like, okay, now let's look at my seed catalogs. Let's look online. Let's get my garden plan ready. Start laying out where my beds are going to go, how I'm going to lay everything out. So and I, I'm going to back up just a little bit. I usually plant garlic at the end of September. So it has enough time to get established, but not so much time that it tries to start fully growing before it gets cold.
And if you wanted to put new seeds down for the winter, where can you buy seeds after season?
Generally, I hit them up there's a couple different sources, but you can hit them up this time of year. They're doing their clearance of seeds. If you're lucky, you can still catch them now. If not, I usually do online sources. There's a lot of different online companies, seed companies. I'll list a couple, but I won't promote any of them specifically. But you can do like Territorial Seed Company. There's Baker Creeks. There's Burpee has a bunch of stuff. Almost any seed company you can still purchase online, and some of them do sales this time of year because it's this year's stock. Now, your seeds are usually viable for 3 to 5 years or longer. Your onions and chives, those are the only ones that I tend to make sure you do fresh every year because they're usually only good for a year. Those seeds are they perish pretty quickly. But if you have seeds and they're older, you may still be able to get them to grow. You just will do a germination test. So let's say you have seeds right now and you're like, I've had these for a few years. I don't know if they still grow. What you'll do is you'll take those seeds, take a wet paper towel, wet like a wet sponge, not dripping, just wet. Put your seeds in this paper towel, fold it over so you've got a nice wet environment, throw it in a Ziploc bag so you can seal it so it stays moist the whole time. Throw it in a warm, dark spot. So I like the top of my refrigerator or next to an appliance that gives off heat. Sometimes I've put it on my cable box or my any of those places that are just a little bit warmer than room temperature, and then check it in a few days. If you look at the seed packet, it normally tells you how long to germinate. Sometimes it's usually like what 3 to 5 days for most seeds, sometimes 5 to 7. If at the very beginning of that germination, you peek open that bag and you see sprouts coming on, let's say, all of the seeds, then you've got a great set of seeds there. Let's say it's only half. Well, you'll need to put double the amount of seeds in what you're doing. So if you want 6 plants, you'll have to put 12 seeds because you've only got half germination.
Mhm.
But that way you can use seeds for many years in the future, even beyond the 3 to 5 year life. I've grown tomato seeds that were 12 years old and they still germinated just fine. So a lot of it depends on how well you take care of those seeds. Keep them in a dry spot. Cooler is better, but dry. So generally don't put them in your refrigerator, at least not for very long. Just find a cool, dark, dry place and they'll last for years.
Thank you.
I'm going to come in here too, Mandy, because I have some questions.
All right.
You talked about doing cover crops.
Yes.
What do I do if I still have my tomatoes producing?
Cover everywhere else.
Okay.
Just hold off on the cover crops until you pull the stuff out of the ground. So if you have tomatoes in one section of your garden, just cover the rest. I would just mulch the tomato area nicely until you pull them out because you're going to hit you can you can still plant them at the end of the frost free date, but I've had issues where they don't always germinate the cover crops then. So I tend to do that on the plants that, like my zucchinis usually end up with powdery mildew at the very end of the season. So I'm going to pull those out anyway. So I'll pull those out and then do a cover crop. But things that are still producing and actively, you're not going to pull those out until you're done. Then you can either cover crop if you're not at the frost free date or just do mulch. I've done cover crop after that date and I've not had good success because you're so clear to the end and they're not frost hardy.
Okay. When you talked about powdery mildew, how would you know if you had that?
If you look at the plant and it looks like it's got a white dust all over it, that is powdery mildew. So like it's usually on zucchini plants or cucumber plants. Those are the ones I normally see it on. It can be on other plants, but it looks like somebody shook baby powder out on your plant. So if you see that real fine, it's a real fine over the whole thing, and it's that, and your leaves start curling up after that usually because it's not going to kill the plant right away. You'll still be able to get a harvest for a while, um, but the plants are going to die off quicker than they will without it. And it's a fungal disease. There's not really a lot you can do about it except just kind of it's based on moisture. So if you've got a really humid year, more plants are prone to get powdery mildew. So the big thing on preventing it is one, don't plant something else that's prone for powdery mildew in the same spot. And two, airflow. So make sure your plants aren't too close together the following year. Because sometimes it's a wet year, but sometimes it's just because you should have had 3 feet of spacing and you decided on 2. So now all your leaves are overlapping and they can't get a good airflow through those leaves. And powdery mildew is more likely to establish in those environments. I had phlox that was totally prone to powdery mildew, and it just every year just start building up, and I eventually just pulled all the phlox out because I'm like, I can't deal with this, because even when I spread them out, I was like, just became a problem in that section of the garden. So I eventually just pulled them all out. I'm like, they'd come back and they'd grow every year and they come back every year, but it was just getting more and more of a mess.
All right, great. Thank you.
Anything else?
I don't see any comments or any questions in the comment section.
No.
Do you have anything else, Tiana?
I do not.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can get those links out there.
I will try to add them in the comment section after we're finished here.
Perfect. Awesome. That was it for me. It doesn't look like we have comments or concerns. Hopefully people still made it even though we were a little late.
Well, Miss Mandy, I wanted to thank you so much for the time that you spent with us this evening. We were able to learn exactly what we need to do to get our garden beds ready for fall and what we need to do to sow in the winter. Wanted to thank all of the participants that tuned in and wanted to thank the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. This Green Living Series workshop was made possible by their generous support from the Love Where You Live Environment Fund.